Hey all, Siege here, and welcome to episode 2 of Siege Thoughts, where I go over aspects of the lore in a less formal manner in order to present more of my feelings and opinions on certain things within the game. Even ideas I think I understand but haven't yet gathered the necessary data to prove, or even ones that maybe don't translate as well to the typical videos produced on the channel. Episode 2 is going to focus on Eternalism and how it actually functions in the game's story. Now, understand I do plan on making an actual video in the very near future regarding what I feel is going to be the official or at least best fit as far as explaining this incredibly confusing concept, because quite frankly, it's just not clarified in any meaningful way. And more I'm thinking that's an intentional thing. Now, before we get too deep into this, I'd like to first thank the channel's members. I can't tell you how appreciative I am of your support, but also feel just blessed to know that you value my content enough to help out as you do. And for that, I am eternally grateful. Also, I can't forget my longtime channel support in G Fuel, a product I still use to this day, and given its longevity on the market, I believe that speaks volumes as to its actual effectiveness and preference among many who, like myself, need a bit of a boost mentally at times. And the fact that I've tried so many and only choose to continue to use a few, this being one of them, is about the best endorsement I can give. So thanks again for all the continued support. For now, remember how I've said in the past DE likes to inject the fourth wall into the game? In this case, it's almost like understanding the story would in fact allow our player character much more power to enact their own will on the events we experience in a way the indifference perhaps would urge against, something we may even be seeing evidence of in the Tau trailer. And I wanted to point this out before I did a complete video on it because I can now gather feedback from others on the perspective that I have in this particular video and take into consideration what you all think as well. In a future episode, I really want to talk about another concept I think Warframe has taken from a very near and dear story to me, one I grew up with, and very much shaped my own thoughts on how becoming involved in the story is much better than just reading one, or even watching, that being the never-ending story itself. I really think video games are the premier form of experiencing a story, especially ones with immersive narratives. Ones that many times include references from a myriad of sources regarding deep philosophical, political, or even cultural aspects that no other medium, entertainment-wise, I think at least, can match. And that is because I believe the personal engagement it offers is second to none. Now, that's going to be for another episode, but in this regard, there are too many little nods to such things in-game to ignore the very real, you better start believing in Warframe stories, 'cause you're in one vibes we seem to continue to get. If at some point there is a scene that has our character staring at the screen asking what we should do next, just remember episode 2, would you? Now, in that very spirit, Eternalism's vagueness in-game contributes to how hard it is to be interpreted verbatim to its original or even evolving explanation, because DE does offer its own spin on the concept, and thus having additional perspectives on the matter will allow for, in theory at least, a much broader comprehension for us all, right? If I'm being completely honest with you all here, I've willingly procrastinated and even actively avoided completing a series on the new war I began a while back because of all the explanations I've heard regarding Eternalism. None fully satisfied the questions I had regarding parts of the lore I knew existed and in almost every case contradicted what I'd been told. Even when it didn't outright contradict it, it definitely wasn't supporting it. The sad truth of the matter is that many of us, myself included at times, create parts of the story in our own headcanon that fill gaps the game itself leaves blank, and thus sometimes advocate aspects of the lore that aren't necessarily correct or, if nothing else, aren't completely confirmed. And well, at least from what I'm trying to do here, don't really work as far as what the channel is always striving for, ultimate truth. Now, understand, I do my best with that. And yes, I am guilty of this very thing in the past and will probably be unknowingly guilty of it in the future. Although, the amount of research I do in each regard is the mechanism I try to have in order to make that not happen. So, in that spirit, here is what I have learned so far about Eternalism. And I have to tell you, I think I finally have a really good bead on what the game actually has set up for what Eternalism is, how it functions, and how it will be both useful for each of our characters for the narrative itself, but also I can see it being a kind of way the narrative is being thread into the indifferences, hatred of what is happening in real time, and thus would explain a lot of its current desires as far as entropy and things of that nature. Something that I think that the Barrow event even reinforced here just recently. If you just look up eternalism in the philosophy of space and time, eternalism is an approach to the ontological nature of time, which takes the view that all existence in time is equally real, as opposed to presentism or the growing block universe theory of time, in which at least the future is not the same as any other time. In order to explain that, I think again, this took me a really long time to kind of visualize, and there are problems with the concept that I still have that I've maintained for a while, and I think was the main reason why I couldn't grasp exactly what was being done here, was because that there still are these issues that I have based upon the idea of what we've already experienced and how we've experienced this. Not to mention the fact that there are humans in the game, and that'll be more relevant later. But think of it this way. The way that the game presents it is that the block, right? So the idea is essentially that the multiverse exists. And just follow me on this, because Eternalism doesn't actually have what you would call a multiverse, but Warframes does. But the idea is that every single situation, every possible permutation of a particular moment, a decision and stuff like that exists already. And it's like in a block, right? So you are essentially living a tons of different blocks over the course of your existence, right? And each one of these things has its own branching other blocks that come from it. But we only see one aspect of the block. So as a human would go through, I mean, you could really make the argument that human beings are literally an eternalistic environment, because it's true. Like, because we have no concept of what the future will hold, we can't see the future. Every one of our decisions is already basically predetermined in that regard. But that doesn't mean that the choices of every individual moment aren't still there, and thus present the opportunity for a different choice. Like I said, you would need to understand the first choice in order to go back and change the choice, because without the concept of an idea of what you're going to do, you can't then change what you're going to do. And that works, in my opinion, that works in pretty much every scenario here as well. Even in a situation where somebody decides at the very last minute that they're going to change their mind on something, that you could make the case, oh, well, look, they just changed their mind. Well, no, they were always going to change their mind at that point. That was always going to be the thing. They just didn't know it. Just like every other situation, when you come into a scenario where you have a choice to make, you don't know what those choices are going to cost you later, and thus you don't know the gravity of them unless you've already actively researched a choice that you know is coming. And again, by that regard, you knowing that the choice comes allows you to research, which would then always have you predetermined to make that particular choice. So in our own existence, like, you could make the case that the future is already predetermined, and it is no less real if you could figure out a way to actually access it. But it is there. It's already done. And even if you made a different choice, that's done too. So in this regard, with Warframe, each one of these little decisions that you have allows the timeline to, for every individual person, go back to very specific moments and flip the block to something that they have already done. This keeps the paradox from occurring because technically you didn't do anything that you didn't already do. I know that's very, very complicated and confusing, and that was one of the problems that I had with it, is that I don't understand how that could be possible. But in this regard, every single decision that you've made has a block. Every scenario has its own little block. And if you were to have the ability to access the block, you could then change the block. And you would not create a paradox because you would essentially be just kind of like turning a prism to shine a light in a different direction. Now, in the basis of regular Eternalism, they don't contend that there's a multiverse associated with this that one can actually access in this manner because, we don't have the ability for this sort of thing. At least that's how I understand it. But in Warframe, because of our ability to go back to different situations and change the block, we have this access to a multiverse, a built-in multiverse that even without choices being made has already been there. And essentially the strands of Kra are ones that engage the current allowance of your timeline based upon the decisions that you have already made. I think this is one of the big problems that the Indifference has with what's going on with Albert and Trotty right now. That in theory, if I'm right on this, you could make the argument that if everything is predetermined, as far as the original, what you would call the original set of blocks, and they're the way that they're supposed to be configured naturally, Warframe's Eternalism flies in the face of that and expands the known realities, because before they were contained to a possibility, but now every possibility is theoretically accessible and thus can be enacted. And in that regard, you would have the situation where you also have to take in consideration the consequences that would come from it, the changes that would occur. And just overall, if you're looking at it from the perspective of the Indifference and what's kind of been a continued idea that has been permeating for at least since Whispers in the Walls, but I think you could even make the argument that that there were ideas that were kind of injected in there as well that was already making this point, but that it's ready for things to start over. And this could very well be because of the meddling of the first and Trotty, but potentially the Orkin too, because I've made this point in the past. If in fact the Orkin had access to this concept in any way, shape, or form, I cannot see a situation where they did not utilize it. That's just not within the character of the Orkin. Such a powerful thing, if in theory could happen, and with them essentially really apparently having to have really embraced Albert and Trotty. And why I say this is because it doesn't say anywhere that Entrati is a member of the Seven. Like, there is nowhere in the game that I've ever found that has a link or is even insinuated that he was one of the Seven, right? His statues are everywhere, and they're not just in like certain areas that are specific to Albert and Trotty, like in the Necrolisc and Deimos and things like that. They're everywhere. They're even on the Zeraman. And in fact, I would say they are the most prominent statue that is shown in all different types of architecture in Orkin places. So with that in mind, he was very much revered. I would have to assume that while, yes, him being the father of the void and them being able to travel through the void would be a thing that would make him revered, at the same time, they would also understand how important everything he was doing was, and would also probably try to have their hands in it, just like every other government would. You see it in everything. It's not just in Warframe, in Marvel with Tony Stark and stuff. The government's always trying to get his stuff. And I think even you hear instances of it all the time in real life. And they have their own reasons, but no matter the reason, to me, the idea that there is this incredibly powerful concept. If you've seen Back to the Future, you have Marty McFly in the second one, who's a relatively good person. And the first thing he can think of whenever he gets the opportunity to go back in time is to grab a sports almanac and bring it into this time so that he can start betting and making money. Like, that's a half decent human being. And I think that a lot of people in that very same situation would look at it as kind of almost like a victimless crime, even though it would be a horrible crime against the fabric of reality. But you don't think in those terms. Marty didn't. Marty McFly. And I would think that given that, a human being that is fairly decent, not a piece of garbage, if you will, if their first thought at having that type of power is to utilize it for their own gain, imagine what the first thought of the Orokin was whenever it was brought to them. Hey, by the way, look at what we can do with this thing. Every single choice you've ever made, I can send you back and we can change that and you can make a different choice. Now, it does make you wonder on a lot of different things Orokin related. Like if many of the things that are occurring right now weren't always within their own design in some capacity. It could be one of the reasons why Entradi is asking for the Orokin's forgiveness versus, say, any method of his own comeuppance, if you will, trying to atone for that. I don't know if Entradi actually does that sort of thing. He's very staunch in his own beliefs. The idea that he is putting this moniker over here and saying, can the Orokin ever be forgiven? That to me insinuates at least that there is something that he doesn't necessarily associate himself with that they've done that he views as a terrible thing too. And I think in many of my older videos, you can see that I've been attempting to kind of make this the case that it's not just Entradi that the indifference has a problem with, that it is the Orokin overall. Entradi is just maybe even a piece, or it's very possible that Entradi could be in a similar situation that we are, that the man on the wall doesn't necessarily view Entradi as a bad person or someone that's against them, rather like a misguided child that it still needs to try to educate to what's going on, and thus has seemingly let Entradi off the hook like so many times. Like, if you're going to do anything with the guy, why didn't you do anything with him when you had him right there in the Hex Quest? Why didn't you do anything? And perhaps just like with us, that it seems like even though when we're not necessarily doing what it wants, it doesn't bring the full weight of its power down on us or do anything, because it's not viewing us as an enemy, rather like I said, like a misguided child. Like, even in you can use a pretty good analogy here, I think, with Thanos and with the MCU interpretation of the Infinity Saga. I've always thought that it's funny at the end of Infinity War, if you notice, Thanos isn't trying to kill anybody. He's just trying to move people out of the way. And it's almost like you would if like you have a young child who's, irate or something and coming at you and, you know, flailing away, and it's just you just kind of like you just kind of hold them back for a second. You're not going to do anything. You're not going to try to hurt them, even though they're hitting you. They're just a child. In the same way that I look at that almost as what the indifference is essentially dealing with at the moment, and why it seems to be so restrained. But getting back into eternalism here, because sometimes I go off on a little tangent here. It's not necessarily a bad tangent because it makes sense. But with that in mind, it's interesting that Warframe does introduce this other aspect of a multiverse already in existence. And the more that I think about it, the more that scene in the new war makes sense, where our operator shakes the hand. Essentially, what the indifference did at that point is take all the other variations of that moment. And now, follow me on this one. I'm not 100% certain that all of them are dead. I don't want to get too deep into another theory I've been kind of cooking up here recently, but I figure I'll throw it out there, a little taster, if you will. You know how, like, whenever the operator, quote unquote, dies, they go to that void space that they almost look like they're asleep. Is it possible that every one of the operators are being held in some kind of stasis? Like that moment didn't necessarily show any of the operators being destroyed or killed, but rather being subdued into the void itself. And then if your operator dies in the really real world, another one from that area, from that decision, is then injected into the moment, to the next moment, and your world goes on. Mainly because whereas this multiverse is introduced, it's not actually in play. It's not living. It's just a possibility. So in that regard, this allows for the paradox to not affect the world. See, there is a multiverse, but it's contained. Think of it as every decision's possibilities is contained within the block that I referred to earlier. In that all that stuff is sitting right there. And if you want to access another aspect of it, you need to turn it. So the full brunt of the multiverse is contained in the block, if you will. It's never fully allowed out, but it can be accessed and thus changed and injected and allow for things to occur that don't even necessarily have an explanation in the observable world. And that's the key. We are living the observable world of Warframe, but there is a multiple other worlds that, depending on if they were observed, could be enacted. But because they aren't, they just kind of sit in a kind of that Schrodinger's cat thing, where essentially, like, it's we don't actually know if it happens or not, because until we observe it, we don't see. So it's actually kind of brilliant, and it's a really cool way of explaining a lot of the things that are happening in the game. Like, in that regard, what the indifference has essentially done is taken the operator doing anything else in that moment away, versus taking away potentially every other operator. Now, again, that last part is still speculation. It's very possible that, whenever you see the operators grab their nose or whatever and they just fall over, that they could be dying, it just being removed from existence. But it always seemed weird to me that there was this thing where, like, the operator dies, they just go to this void space that they sleep in, and then they're back. And Eternalism being what it is, and this whole block theory, and the idea that it's very possible in that scene, especially given that the the way the scenes look is identical. I mean, it's the same situation, the same color, same space, and it would allow for one, this connection that we see in the new war with our drifter, because essentially it's just the block is changed in that moment. The only thing about it is that you have to ask the one question that the new war never answers is who did it? Because the way that the memories are given to us in game, it's like they're these little pieces that they're offered to us. And they come at different, very odd portions. Like you'll get done with a mission and then you'll go to a memory on the Zariman. Or in one case, like, you come back from giving one of the Archon shards or something and thing happens. Or in the part where kind of the climax occurs, you have the Lotus shooting at us with the beam and destroying Ortis first, and then that moment being kind of a catalyst. Now, is it the Drifter's emotional loss of Ortis that triggers that final moment? And I would say, why was that a trigger and other ones didn't have the same thing? Like one of the triggers was when he was coming up from, or she was coming up from Hun House area. Ortis says, "Hey, you lived." He says, "Yeah." He said, "A bastard even gave me homework." And then it goes right into it. So it wasn't like they were in extreme trauma in that moment or in an overly emotional state for another reason, except for being, I don't know, excited or mad that they got homework. Tough to say. But the fulcrum for why at certain moments we see Eternalism show up in the new war is still like the major question, but it's the question that's hidden, because whenever you play the game, you're more concerned or more questioning, okay, how is this even happening versus how did it happen? Like, who enacted this? And I think this is where that portion of the story is going to get potentially unearthed as we keep going. We know that the void itself is the method, is the fuel by which all this stuff is possible. But is the void enacting certain things? And then again, you would have to ask yourself, if that is the case, then the drifter being a part of the world would be a product of the indifference's desires, unless there is somebody else who enacted on that particular moment. I suppose you could sort of make the case that it's the Lotus, but it doesn't really seem like that's what she's doing, especially in the situation where she's actively chasing the drifter around and trying to presumably kill them, I guess. I suppose it could be like an underhanded thing that she was trying to bring out the innate power there, but I would contend that something else is protecting the operator throughout the course of the new war. And I don't think it's the Lotus. So with that in mind, I think you can see how Eternalism was made to be the front and center issue to grab your attention as to what the hell just happened here. But there was the back end of it is, well, who did this? And that's the story that keeps going, which that's the most fun story, if you ask me. I was just talking about this in my last video on Baroque Katir. I'll bet you any money that the moment that Baroque Katir met with the fine gentleman was a very similar situation, where all these different Barrows were supposedly either removed or congealed into one. And a lot of people contended that the red Barrow Rosé, as I like to call him, is a drifter variation of Barrow, like one that was kind of in the same situation, caught in the void. What I would say about that is a couple things. One, there isn't any type of age difference. So there is that difference in between the two of them. They looked identical in age. Also, and I've made this comment on a couple other comments on the video, if Barrow's desire was to be the only one, that does seem to be going against the deal that he was offered. So I don't know what the cosmic consequences of the void, like actively undermining the deals that it's trying to give. I feel like the deals themselves are nefarious enough, but I could be wrong. There could be an aspect to the indifference that really is every bit like what you would consider to be like a trickster or, a devilish character or something like that, where even the deals that are made come with some kind of little caveat that the person didn't know about. And I suppose you could make the argument that there is evidence of that, where we see in one of the tablets that's in Deviri where it says, I said I'd save them. I never said I'd save you, or something to that regard. That this particular variant wasn't necessarily included in the deal, and that, well, you should have just known that. Sorry you didn't read the fine print, if you would. So at the end of the day, I think what you really have to question with Eternalism is how much of it that we've seen is being enacted by Orkin or human forces, and how much of it, at least up to this point, has been driven by the indifference. I think you can make the case that that is the concept or the story behind 1999 as well, that there is a 1999 that absolutely was destroyed. It's one of the possibilities. And it is the one possibility that I think has been enacted when we fight the Coda. That's why we fight outside the atmosphere of Earth. It was a possibility that was brought into play. And I also wonder if this doesn't have implications with Lotus's deal with the moon. Because it would explain, at least in my opinion, one of the things I've always wondered was if the moon is in the void, how does all the effects of not having a moon, how does it translate in the way that, like, because there would be a lot of really bad things that would occur, and you can make the case that it's still there in some way, shape, or form based upon this idea. And that, I guess maybe hiding it, you can bring it back out. Maybe that, I guess it is possible too that just hiding it was only hiding it in like the world underneath the world, or the reality just underneath the reality, so that the effects of it not being there wouldn't be felt. But I also think that you could use Eternalism as another potential reason why that isn't something that is necessarily shown to have a major effect on the planet, because there's a pretty good amount of time in the beginning of the game where we play without the moon, at least it being visible. So I think that is something that could have been used as well as part of an aspect of the bargaining tool. But again, speculation. These are things that I just kind of wanted to talk about in a forum like this, where I can kind of get out my thoughts, my little stream of consciousness thoughts, and maybe some things that I wouldn't have never, actually said in a full video I can bring out here. And then somebody else said, oh yeah, by the way, I was thinking about that, and how about this? And that's how, ideas grow. I think, if anything, what we can say, for me at least, is at the moment, every single one of these little blocks makes up an entire reality or an entire lifetime of a person, and thus allows for this unified experience. Now, here's one of the major problems I still have with this entire thing altogether. I want to know how the change in a particular aspect of the past affects the mind of a person in the present, because we're implying a shared universe here, not just a universe for one. Now, if it was a universe that only the operator or only the drifter experienced and everything else was kind of like a simulation, this works fine. But the problem is that other people within the main existence would still have experiences and a linear understanding of how one thing got to another over the course of their life. And if that was changed in any way, shape, or form by the actions of, the operator or the drifter or the indifference or whoever, the Orkin, I've always wondered, or I've often wondered, how does somebody process that? Do they have what's called a looping consciousness, where essentially like their mind can just kind of almost a little bit like the butterfly effect in that movie, where the mind just kind of, interprets and takes it into everything. But in the case of Warframe, there's no detrimental effects, at least from what we can see. Like people it just happens and they just go about their day. Like these new memories from wherever have just been imprinted, and it's on there and it's done, and they don't even know that it's happened. And really the only people that are ever made aware of any real change in the game is the operator and us. Maybe going back to that whole fourth wall break thing. I'm telling you, it's there. It's already there in a bunch of different things. So it's really now, how many times is Warframe touching the fourth wall? It's not a situation if they do it or not. So, but in that regard, that's the one thing that it's kept me from really attempting to put my full thoughts on, especially the new work, because it's the quintessential quest. And if you look at my channel, I really don't have. I have a lead up to it, but I just couldn't do it because of this whole Eternalism thing, and how, in order for me to put a video out on Eternalism, I wanted to make sure unequivocally that I had an understanding of it that at least would suffice. Because acting like there is a firm and definitive, this is how it is, especially in some of these really, really vague, super vague concepts that aren't really given a lot of, especially in game, like in the campaign or in the heat of the moment explanation. Like you might be able to find some more in codexes and things of that nature, descriptions on different items and such, but like just in the game itself, it's it can allow itself for a bunch of different interpretations. That being said, I think I'm getting very close to having a really good understanding of it. It does force me to accept certain things, pure and simple. It forces me to accept that there are aspects of it that just aren't going to make sense. The looping consciousness thing is a major one. That's just going to be how it is. At some point, Warframe may put something into the game to kind of address that. And I mean, you could really write in anything. I mean, you could even write in that just, hey, when Eternalism happens, just the moment of, I mean, you could look at this as a deep conscious thing, like that think of it as all living creatures are connected in this kind of neural network of the collective unconscious. And everybody has their own, like, direct connection to it. You could make the argument that when these changes are being made, it's almost like the universe gets an update and everybody gets a download, and it all comes into everybody's brains. And like a lot of updates that come for your computer, certain things, because it's not something that you even were thinking about, or maybe were never even involved in, only the things that happened maybe 2 and 3 and 4 degrees after the fact, or something that you would have read at some point, something that in most people's minds wouldn't have really registered as being anything significant. Now, in some it would have, but maybe the super small amount of people that would actually think about that, and when it would hit their head, it would have affected them personally. Maybe they're the ones that go to the different people and are like, hey, this is, I'm telling you, my memory's changed. And then everybody else who didn't even care about that particular thing or had no association with it, and in their mind, maybe didn't know about it, or, like I said, it was so far gone from the things that actually did affect them that they really didn't know how it began in the first place. So not knowing how it changed didn't change anything. They may have looked at these people like, this guy's nuts. What's he talking about, man? What are you saying? My memories are all the same. Bob, your memory's the same? Johnny, at the end of the day, perhaps that is the in-game description that's kind of just sitting there in front of me that I'm just still not willing to accept because of those few people that would, especially a lot of people I think that's probably the reason why I've fought against it so much, is that people in the story that we actually interact with would be the ones that would have had the old ideas and then now having the new ideas, and none of them seem to have a problem with any of that. So that potentially says that that's what's going on when the block changes. So if you go pick a time back in time, the block changes, the collective unconscious, that information goes up into the collective unconscious and then is downloaded into the universe's brains, and everything changes that's supposed to change based upon that. And it's entirely possible that, as I'd mentioned before, maybe the crux of everything is that the indifference is not really caring for this like random employee who keeps going into the system and changing shit and not telling anybody else about it. Like, I know what that's like. I've been in a job where, you had multiple people going up to IT and saying, hey, if I can get this changed and a certain thing here, this would make my job like so much easier. Oh, so then, IT's like, puts in a thing. They didn't really, because they didn't necessarily know that it would affect anybody else. Maybe they should have. Maybe that's not the point. The point is the change was made, and then as I'm doing my things are changing, and I don't understand the why. Then I go to IT and I'm like, hey, my reports, they're different. Like, what's going on? I don't understand. What's this? But to other people, maybe they just accept that change, and in that regard are okay with every little block turning, potentially even really affecting them greatly. But if they never really engage in the idea in the first place, perhaps their need for like a calm around them and to not be thought of as crazy people just makes them, neglect the idea and just maybe think of it as, pass it off as nothing more than deja vu. Like, oh man, I could have sworn I thought something else there. Mandela effect. There it is. To me, that's where I think we can maybe put an explanation. But again, as I had mentioned earlier in the video, if we were to say something like that, even though it really fits and works, it's still not necessarily canon, because there's nowhere in the game that fully says that that's the case. So DE tomorrow could come up with a whole new thing. Even if we figure it out and it's like, we have this down, this is exactly how it works, blah, blah, blah. They could add the tiniest little change to it and make it function differently to incorporate the story. Now, one of the things I think DE is very good at is staying true to what they've already written. We've only seen what I would consider, at least from my perspective, a couple official rewrites, and a lot of it has to do with 1999, which, again, you could make the argument that that's intentional. But given a game with this long a story going and not having tons and tons of especially significant events being rewritten, that may change with Tau. But I think in a lot of cases, I've actually seen comments where people say, Warframe changes the story all the time. I think they don't necessarily change the story. It's just the interpretation of the story gets changed. And that's not necessarily on DE. That's on us for interpreting a particular way. Even if all the evidence claims to point to that particular thing, unless it's completely and totally verified by some in-game source, and I'm talking about in-game source, not something like someone mentioning something in a dev stream or something like that, because that stuff gets changed all the time. So to me, that's not ironclad unless it's in the lore somewhere or you actually see it presented in the game. It's still interpretation. And that works out great for me, because that's pretty much what my entire channel is about, interpreting this wonderful story. I personally just love this story. It just keeps getting better and better. And I think this portion of interpreting the narrative is a big deal, because it's going to allow me to, one, actually finish the new war videos that I've wanted for a long time to do. I mean, it is probably the most important story in the game, given what occurs, what's confirmed. It really changes everything. And I think it sets the Warframe narrative off in a very particular direction. And so I definitely want to get that at some point done. But I also think that having this understanding for what's coming is going to be huge, because I also think what we saw in that Tau trailer is probably some aspect of what I just went over. That when the operator connects to the Lotus, that memory was another possibility that perhaps was not, it could be one of two things. It was not one that ever occurred within our timeline. Okay? That could be the first thing, that was a choice that whatever group of choices led to the whole situation that we're about to see on Tau never occurred. But there is the possibility too, and I would say that some of the things that Lloyd says within the trailer may in fact allude to this, that the history that we understand now may itself be a rewrite of particular situations. And that this thing that we're seeing in Tau, being some kind of polluted history, as he calls it, could be either the initial timeline or a timeline that was rewritten over once before. Because that's another thing I've talked about in previous videos, is that we don't necessarily know we don't know how many times Eternalism was enacted and what changes came from it, other than the ones that we've just been shown in game. If there are more instances, how many were there? And if there are many more, what changes have been made to the basic, what you would say, the grouping of the blocks that the light shines on, the method by which they've all been turned so that it's supposed to be, versus how many times has somebody went back, be it the Void, be it Entrati, be it the Orcan, whoever, have went back and actually changed something in the now, or in the then, and it affects the now. I do think that's something that we're going to have to contend with here. There are consequences for all of this. I'm certain that there has to be a level of consequence for all these changes, even if Eternalism does account for all possibilities based upon the idea that everything has essentially already happened. Every single particular decision has already been made, and every decision's possibilities is contained in a block. And all you need to do is find the block, turn the key or turn it around, and a different decision goes. Gets implemented into the whole, and many are none the wiser because of it. Whatever method by which that is occurring is, I think, going to be a major focus moving forward into Warframe, and is one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of put this particular episode out with the Devil's Triad coming up and Tau coming up, so that at least, if nothing else, because there's so many other things happening, that if I'm not able to get to a full video on Eternalism or on the new war or both in the time that we see Tau, that I'll have at least kind of spoken about this and given you, if you are unsure about the idea of Eternalism and how it functions, kind of at least a visualization of what's going on there, so that if this mechanism is used in future storytelling with Warframe, which I'm certain it's going to be, that you'll have an idea of what's actually happening as it's happening, and thus be able to enjoy what you're seeing a little bit more, instead of being confused. Because I think a lot of us during the new war looked at some of those scenes, and while they were cool because they were kind of focusing on the man on the wall and the deal, if you will, something that everybody had been really excited about seeing and kind of figuring out more about, where the operator's power was coming from, it still left a lot to be desired in understanding, what just happened here. So much so that I think to this day, there is still a lot of confusion. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, I really do think was intentional. I think it's just something that DE is starting to integrate into their storytelling, that you're not going to find out about the story until, like, the full story, probably until years later. You're going to get the general gist of what the actions that you are doing in the story are doing in the game or to the story. And the surface story itself, that will be something that you will understand. But all the little mechanisms underneath that are allowing the story to even occur, that is something that consistently is a thing that you will not figure out until later. And in this regard, even though we've had years now, I feel really confident about my interpretation of it finally and how it works. I don't myself even now completely know every little aspect of it. And there are parts of it that, while I'm interpreting them and feel very confident on that interpretation, if you asked somebody at DE, they could be like, yeah, that's completely wrong. I don't know where you got that. That would be disheartening. But again, kind of in, if you will, as a summation, it's actually kind of simple, but its implications are profound, in that every single person has their own little blockchain. It's the best way I can describe it, that goes up through the entirety of their lives. And every possibility lays within this block. If you could access the block, because of the fact that you've already done everything that the block allows you to do, and thus every one of the other blocks has already taken into account all of these other things, you wouldn't even have the paradoxical aspect of the thing occur. What I assume would happen is that if you went to block A, changed block A, it does appear that block B and further will then take on the aspects of the possibilities that were in them to account for block A's change, thus never engaging in what we would call a paradox. Again, my problem is for everybody else that lives in block B now, how do they experience that? Not to mention that, again, one of the things that I think is really important in understanding the effect on the humans, especially in the Warframe stories, is that we don't think in a multi-dimensional existence without the idea of time. Our lives are experienced through a linear progression. We do things now because of things that we did years before. Things that we're good at now happen because we did things years before to become good at them. there is a cause and effect here that eternalism doesn't take into consideration and just allows for this kind of like bypass from one road to another. So essentially saying that I turn on this street, and now because I've went on this street, in order to get to the same place, my GPS has turned and essentially has taken the new possibility in block B and activated it in my brain, essentially believing now that block B was always the main block, and thus block C, block D, block E, block F, block G, onward now have been shifted. And because you've already experienced, your brain already knows it's got all the possibilities in each little block, it has thus turned all those blocks accordingly in order to account for the change. But as I've mentioned before, and I think, like I said, as the story goes, something to keep an eye out for, is this the reason why the indifference is having such issues now? That we are, in fact, messing too frequently with the fabric of reality, and that certain people like Entrati don't have a appreciation for that, and thus with so many of these groups now coming into play and already have been with the Orkin, that maybe it's time to just start over, bring everything to silence again, because all of our decisions keep moving everything further away. When we make a decision and introduce a new potentiality, it moves further away from ending as they began into that singular, predetermined, let's say, intelligently designed initial timeline. But that's just my thoughts. And with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this second episode, and I got you thinking about what else that you would like to have discussed in this type of format. I realize this is a lot less formal, but it does allow me to get a lot of thoughts out that I wouldn't necessarily express in a video. And while it would be something I would do in a stream, streaming doesn't necessarily get to as many viewers as these type of videos do. So I think this is a good kind of symbiosis between the two, if you will. And I really like doing them because I can just sit there and kind of just speak my mind. But what did you think about my take on Eternalism? Is there anything that you would add or take away from what I've interpreted from this? I'm really interested in hearing this because it will shape not only my opinion of Eternalism in general, but the videos that I'm going to be making on it in the future. So at any rate, I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you tune in for the next one. Not really sure what it's going to be on yet, but depending on your comments, maybe they'll shape what comes next. But of course, I hope you all have a wonderful day today, a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk at you all in the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye.